Hello everyone, and welcome once again to my channel. Today we'll be looking at how to solve questions involving ratios and proportions. Ratios and proportions. Now let's look at the first one, which is ratios. What are ratios, or what is a ratio? Now, a ratio is the comparison between two or more quantities. It is the comparison between two or more quantities using the method of division, which involves dividing the first quantity by the other. Now, we can also say that the comparison or simplified form of two quantities of the same kind and same units is referred to as a ratio. So this is just two ways of defining what a ratio is. It's a comparison between two or more quantities using the method of division, or it can be said to be that comparison or simplified form of two quantities of the same kind and the same units. Now, the two numbers in a ratio, that is the two or more numbers in a ratio, can only be compared when they have the same unit. So let's take note of that. Now, the sign commonly used to denote a ratio is this. This sign is usually used to denote ratios. This sign, so whenever you see that sign, then it's talking about a ratio. Now, a ratio can also be written as a fraction. A ratio can also be written as a fraction. Hence, a ratio can be represented in three different forms, such as A to B, A ratio B, or A over B. So these are the ways that you can represent a ratio. This A to B is usually when writing in words. Then this A ratio B is when we're using the symbol that is used to denote a ratio. Then also a ratio can be represented by a fraction. You have A ratio B, then here we have A over B, which means that this can also be converted to this. So whether you see it as A to B, or A ratio B, or A over B, then these are the different forms in which a ratio can be represented. Now, for this, A, which is the very first term in the ratio, is known as the antecedent, or first term, while the B is known as the consequent, or you can call it the second term. So this very first term here, or here, or here, is known as the antecedent or the first term, while the second one is known as the consequent or the second term. Now, let's assume that we have two quantities, as such as we have here on the board, A and B. And we have to find the ratio of these two quantities. In order to do this, we're going to have to use the formula of the ratio. And that formula of the ratio is just the combination of this and this. So the formula of the ratio is simply A ratio B is equal to A all over B. You can call this the ratio formula. So this is what we use when we have to find the ratio of a given quantity or entity or numbers. So now let's go to the second aspect of the teaching of today, which is proportions. Proportions. Now, what are proportions? Proportions, or a proportion, is an equation that defines that the two given ratios are equivalent to each other. In other words, the proportion states the equality of the two fractions or the two ratios. So it more or less, proportions more or less shows the equality of two ratios, so that these two ratios are equal to each other. Now, the proportions are denoted by the symbol equals. Just as ratios use this symbol to be denoted, proportions are denoted by the equal symbol. Now let us assume in proportion that we have two ratios, and those two ratios are A ratio B and C ratio D. Now the two terms B and C, these two terms B and C are called the means. They are called the means or mean term or mean terms. While the terms A and D, the terms A and D are known as the extremes or the extreme terms. They are known as the extremes or extreme terms. Okay, so now once we have these two ratios, in order for us to now derive the proportion formula, we will now have something like this. A all over B is equals to C all over D. Now this is the proportion formula. Just like we have the ratio formula, this is the proportion formula. Anytime we want to use the proportion to equate two or maybe even more ratios.